Hey, what's up, guys? Almost at the end of this. Actually, I want to really go over the comics at the end. A really brilliant selection on the part of the author, but there's enough in this one here, which was, of course, the future. Okay, this is written in 1983, so we got a couple of decades here. So, and it's interesting how they mentioned one of the byproducts, right? The new visual generation, right? Young Japanese live in an age, right, in the 80s that emphasized the image. Television, videotape recorders are everywhere. Comics comprise roughly 70% of all books published, right? The Japanese are Shikaku Saidai, the visual generation. And it's pretty true. They actually like this. They have like public things here done as cartoons. What is this? That's if I first put out the fire. Ah, like most people, he's running. And as you go through, we got challenges for the industry. Of course, this is before the major economic trouble that hit Japan in the 90s. Right? Perhaps the comics industry has become too successful. Japanese comics like American rock and roll music begins limited form of entertainment for young people. Now, both are ponderous industries in the mainstream of society. That's a very interesting look, right? Everything eventually becomes right, mainstream, or have we ended? We may have ended that, right? Maintain the vitality and the fresh talent, right? You need human capital, right? It's the greatest capital of all. Right? Many of the newer artists, despite their technical skills, seem short on soul. Now, this is interesting. This is in the 80s. You can always argue that. You know the old argument, like, oh, oh, you don't like you don't like Taylor Swift, but your parents they didn't like Slayer, right? They start using arguments like that. But even people who are younger, who are perceptive, they see when they look at old stuff, like they see on YouTube, a minority of them, but a significant number of them who seem to have a higher IQ, they seem to notice that, yeah, the older stuff is better. Straight up, okay? You can argue that that was always a cliche, okay? But I think the gap is a lot wider now where you really start to see that as being absolutely the case. Okay? Their work lacks the power to move the reader. When the pioneers of the industry began their careers, they often did so in the face of parental opposition. Prospects have an exceedingly bleak economic future, right? These were men who were born and lived in the aftermath of what? The war. Always the war. Okay? I'm going through more here. We got stuff here. We'll go more to the thing. American comics have been distributed around the world, right? Will Japan in the world? Japanese comics followed Toyotas and Sony's overseas. Will they become the second wave after American comics to sweep the world? Well, in a way, you could argue that this is the case. Currently, as we are speaking, manga outsells American comics. Okay, if you go to any Barnes and Noble, you will see the translated manga section is huge. Okay, my late fiance passed away just before they really started doing that. So every time I go to a Barnes and Noble, and I walk through and I look at the manga section translated, and I see probably the largest section of the bookstore, I always think of her. I always think of what she would have thought as a girl who grew up with Taiwanese bootleg manga in Chinese. I always wonder what she would have thought of that. Oh well. Now, the interesting part of this is how they go right, the Japanese comics, right? Japanese comics have managed in several instances, right? Always in drips and drabs and weird places, across the cultural barrier between East and West, okay? Even in America, but you're going to see Europe, right? Mother Europe, is where the Japanese comics actually made an impact in the 70s and the 80s, okay? But even in America, right? Look, you have what is this? They had an Astro Boy comic. Obviously, Astro Boy was a cartoon. They translated it into English, but Gold Key. Look at that. Interesting. So in 1965, a comic book called Astro Boy was published in America by Gold Key Comics. Right? Young readers noted how different it was. Right? Obviously, the show was on. This was in conjunction with the show. Another Japanese manga that got through, right, and for a very different reason. The only Japanese story comics published in America using the original artwork are those of Keiji Nakazawa, right? The late 1970s, a non-profit peace group in Tokyo published Barefoot Jud, an English paperback edition of Hadashi no Jud. It's like, if you've seen Grave of the Fireflies, imagine that for the atomic bomb. Right, this account of the atomic bomb of Hiroshima is a message strong enough to surmount most cross-cultural problems. It is very hard to read, and it is very hard to watch the animated film. It really, if the stuff I was going over in the Thomas Goodrich book, you really get that, but from the perspective of a young man, a boy who was there. Okay, of course, it's too graphically violent for the Comics Code Authority. Right. Here's a good point. Foreign comics are seldom published in America, but foreign artists, Filipinos, for example, I told you, the backup artists and some of the art for, like, let's say the Gold Key Comics, the Filipinos. A lot of the awards, the GI Combat stories were drawn by Filipinos. Okay, who I argue have both a Japanese manga influence and a European, particularly Spanish, Italian comic influence in their art style. Okay, and they've often worked for American magazines. Right. Interesting. So, they actually had in Conan. They actually had a Japanese guy illustrate a story. That's interesting. Of course, remember in America, what was it? Heavy metal. Right. Heavy metal was like the European style comic. European style comics were, at the time, considered the mature, racy comics. Okay, and heavy metal was sort of an attempt to do that in America. Yeah. Yeah, I saw it, right? God, this is hard. And it's funny too to see Astro Boy. What's this in Peru? Like, right, once again, the Japanese stuff is always popular in South America, right? What's this? Tres chiflados peligrosos. Oh, the Three Stooges. Yeah. And of course, right, you have all these shows that were translated into English very haphazardly, like, Star Blazers, Force 5, Space Giants, Andy Nowicki's favorite childhood TV show. Of course, I remember the toys, the Shogun Warriors, they were the toys. But I remember the Marvel comic. I remember this. Make a friggin' omnibus of this. I remember this. Shogun Warriors. And the Godzilla comic, too. I think I've forgotten. They had the tie-up with Mattel. I didn't know Mattel had something to do with the Shogun Warriors. And of course, I always bring up the other thing, the direct market of American comics, where you started to get the Viz editions of the translated mangas and the first comics, translated versions of Lone Wolf and Cub, Mai the Psychic Girl, the Robotech adaptations from Kamiko, right? Elf Quest, right? Wendy Pini, right? Elf Quest was very much an underground or a very independent comic, and you can see the style is definitely influenced by the Japanese. And of course, Frank Miller. Frank Miller literally, put gave his blessing to these comics. He actually helped, probably more than most people, to try to introduce the Japanese manga to the mainstream of the American comic style. Obviously, remember, when he was drawing Wolverine. Wolverine was in the East a lot, fighting the Silver Samurai, and he had a Japanese wife. Of course, the opposite is kind of easy, right? The opposite is not really happening. They really can't get the American comics to be more than a cult thing in Japan. This was in the 80s when you had good comics from DC and Marvel. So obviously, and once again, I'll bring up the other thing that people don't know. Japanese comics culture had a far greater influence in Mother Europe. Right? Candy Candy by Yumiko Igarashi and Kayoko Mizuki had been a remarkable success in Italy. Okay, Italy they loved the Japanese comics, the girly comics, the giant robots comics, the violent comics. They translated a lot of the shows into Italian, and it's always funny the manic kind of voice acting you have in the Japanese cartoons. The Italian language actually fits in very well, as does the Spanish, where they're always yelling and running around doing crazy things. And it's funny how Candy Candy is a rare example of the internationalization of Japanese comics. Little Italian children had no idea the starry-eyed, blonde-haired heroine in the story was created in Japan. She's actually an American character, and it was so popular that they continued it even though the series had ended in Japan. They just had a local artist draw and have new stories. And of course, the giant robots, and France too. France was huge, especially with Leiji Matsumoto's stuff. So here you have Mazinga, Go Nagai, one of my favorite artists, writers. Right? What was this? Capere, non me lo aspettato, pugno fiore. Right, fire punch. It's like fight. This is interesting. This was published in Switzerland. That looks like the French language though. So anyway, of course, Albator, that was the name for Captain Harlock. I went over her in France. The comics, the best Japanese style comics coming out now are from Ablaze Comics by that French comic artist. I forget his name at the moment, but the Saint Seiya and the Captain Harlock. That is pound for pound the best comics I have seen. Okay. Ever, probably in the last 5 years. Okay, amazing. So, and this is it. Of course, they talk about the Japanese comics officially getting recognition in these countries where long you had a bootleg market, right? And so this is how this chapter ends. Right? Of course, here we go. And like I said, my late fiance, she had a lot of these bootleg ones. Got them in Chinatown. Until recently, South Korea and Taiwan published Japanese comics as authorless pirated editions. Oh, thus denying many Japanese artists needed international exposure. We know who these people were. Come on. So this is basically a snapshot in time of, as of 1983 in Japan, a book on manga, Japanese comics. Probably one of the biggest influences on me creatively, artistically, and anything as you can imagine as a kid. So the fact that this was able to speak to me, although I didn't have I don't think I had a conventional upbringing or a conventional childhood, didn't grow up in a conventional place, and had a very weird ancestry different from most Americans. Maybe that's why this sort of appealed to me. Okay. A lot of traditional things seen in a way different from anything that I was experiencing where I lived, in the ground zero of cultural negation. But let me stop using these big ass words on you. The last video, I'm going to go over the selections here. They have a really good selection, really varied, great creators, interesting art, very diverse kind of stories, mainly historical, and that's what I really like about that he picked these. So anyway, one more video to go for this amazing book, which should be in anyone's library later.